What happens when a tenant takes on a landlord who's been playing by their own rules for far too long? Tasha thought she had the perfect case: illegal rent hikes, broken promises, and neglect of basic living conditions. She wasn't going to let her landlord get away with it. But when the legal battle took a dark turn, she found herself losing far more than just her case. With her home at risk and her future in jeopardy, Tasha was about to discover that fighting for justice could cost her everything. Stay tuned to find out how this devastating showdown changed her life forever. Tasha had always considered herself an ordinary woman. Born and raised in the bustling city of Seattle, she found comfort in the rhythm of daily life, even if it wasn't as glamorous as some might imagine. Her apartment, a small, modest unit on the third floor of a weathered, red brick building, was the sanctuary where she could escape the chaos of her work as a barista at a downtown coffee shop. Though the building was old, the creaks of the walls and the occasional rattle of pipes had become the familiar soundtrack of her life. She lived alone, a quiet soul who found solace in the simple things: the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, the soft rustle of leaves as the wind passed through her window, and the hum of the city that always seemed to offer an undercurrent of comfort. Her apartment was far from perfect, but it was home. The landlord, Mr. Logan Carmichael, had always been a bit of a shadow in her life. She didn't see him often, just the occasional knock on the door to collect rent, his presence looming over her like a faint, distant figure. Tall, with graying hair and a sharp suit that seemed at odds with the weathered building he owned, he exuded a certain cold authority. When he did speak, it was always in the same flat tone, with an air of inevitability. "Rent's due," he would say, as if there was no other option. She didn't mind. It was part of the arrangement. He was the landlord, after all. She paid her rent on time, and life moved on. The building had its quirks: cracked walls, a sometimes faulty heater, but nothing too extreme. The building, like Tasha, had its character. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable. That was enough. But everything started to change around the time of the rent increase. The letters from Mr. Carmichael arrived in her mailbox, each one a bit more demanding than the last. First, a slight increase, nothing that raised alarms. It was only when the second letter arrived that the pressure began to build. The rent would be raised again, by an amount Tasha couldn't quite understand. She had never been told why. She hadn't asked. It was simply a directive, a fact of life in the world of tenants and landlords. But the third letter, the one she received late one evening in mid-July, was the one that sent a ripple of unease through her chest. This time, the increase was substantial, an amount far beyond what was reasonable for a place in this neighborhood. She stared at the letter, its bold print telling her that the new rent would take effect in just 2 weeks. It was a staggering sum, one she knew she couldn't afford. Tasha felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the weight of the letter wouldn't lift. She had always been a quiet person, avoiding conflict when possible. She'd always accepted the rules as they were. But this felt different. Something about the letter, the timing, the amount, it all felt wrong. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do, but she knew this wasn't just a casual rent hike. This felt like an act of power, something more insidious. The next day, Tasha did something she had never done before. She picked up the phone and dialed a lawyer's number. It was a small, local firm, one that advertised affordable tenant rights consultations. Her hands trembled as she spoke with the receptionist, arranging an appointment for the following afternoon. Even then, it felt surreal. What did she even have to say to a lawyer? She had never been in a situation like this before. Her mind swirled with questions. Was this even legal? Could he really increase her rent by that much? Why hadn't he given any reason for it? Was it even worth challenging? The next day, she arrived at the lawyer's office, feeling out of place. The lobby was pristine, with sleek chairs and glossy brochures. She couldn't help but feel a wave of imposter syndrome wash over her. She wasn't a professional, didn't deal with legal matters. She was just a barista in a coffee shop, trying to make ends meet in a city that had started to feel more and more like it was chewing up its residents and spitting them out. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Lisa with short, dark hair and sharp glasses, greeted her warmly but with an air of efficiency. After a quick exchange of pleasantries, Lisa got right to the point. "Can you show me the letter from your landlord?" Lisa asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Tasha handed it over. Lisa scanned the document, her eyes narrowing as she read. "I see," Lisa said, tapping her pen against the desk. "This is a substantial increase. And there's no justification for it. You mentioned this is a rent-controlled building." Tasha nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation pressing in on her. She had always assumed that rent control would shield her from unfair hikes, but this was something else. Lisa's expression grew more serious as she continued to read the fine print of the lease agreement. "We can challenge this," Lisa said finally, her voice steady but laced with a hint of something else, something Tasha couldn't quite place. "If this building is rent-controlled, and if you haven't received proper notice, then he may be in violation of the law." Tasha's heart raced, but a sense of hope also began to bloom in her chest. She had rights. Maybe she wasn't powerless after all. Maybe there was a chance to fight back. But the more Tasha thought about it, the more a sense of dread crept in. The thought of going head-to-head with her landlord, the man who held so much power over her living situation, was daunting. She had heard rumors about him, about how he'd handled previous tenants, how he would often make their lives difficult after they raised a fuss. Tasha had always dismissed these stories as exaggerations, but now she was unsure. She wasn't sure she had the strength to take on someone like him. Still, she couldn't just sit back and accept the rent hike. She couldn't let him win. In the following days, the tension between Tasha and Mr. Carmichael grew. He stopped by to drop off another rent payment reminder, and when he saw Tasha's troubled expression, he casually remarked, "I hope you're not planning to cause any trouble over this increase." His voice was calm, but there was a chilling undercurrent to it. Tasha tried to hide her frustration, but his words lingered in her mind long after he left. It was at this moment that Tasha made a decision. She would take action. She would fight. But little did she know, the battle she was about to enter would not only challenge her beliefs about justice and fairness, it would also strip her of everything she had. Tasha didn't sleep that night. The ceiling above her felt like it was closing in, the pipes groaning in the silence. The faint buzz of a streetlight outside cast long shadows across her apartment walls, twisting and stretching like fingers reaching toward her. Her mind replayed Mr. Carmichael's words again and again, "I hope you're not planning to cause any trouble." It didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a promise. The next morning, she woke up determined. She gathered every piece of paperwork she had, old rent receipts, copies of her lease, the letters of rent increases, and stuffed them into a weathered folder. She took the bus to Lisa's office again, the city rolling past her window in a blur of gray and blue. She told herself this was just a formality, a small step toward justice. But somewhere deep down, she already knew this was going to be much bigger than she'd imagined. Lisa greeted her with the same calm professionalism, but there was a sharpness in her tone this time. "Tasha," she said, scanning the documents, "he's breaking multiple regulations. You have the right to file a formal complaint. If you're willing, we can take this to court." The words "take this to court" made Tasha's stomach turn. She wasn't built for battles like this. But then she thought about her home, the little plant by the window she had nurtured from a sprout, the chipped mug she always used, the faded couch that felt like safety after long shifts. This wasn't just a building. It was her world. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. Lisa nodded. "Then be prepared. It won't be easy. Some landlords don't take kindly to being challenged." She was right. 2 days later, the first sign of retaliation came quietly. Tasha returned from work to find a notice taped to her door, a maintenance warning. According to the note, her apartment had violations that needed immediate repair. Leaks, paint chipping, unapproved wall fixtures, things that weren't even true. She stared at the notice, her pulse racing. It wasn't just a warning. It was intimidation. She called Mr. Carmichael's office number, her hand shaking as she held the phone. No answer. The next day, she found another letter, this time claiming she had been late on rent payments. A lie. She had every receipt, every record. But the accusations were piling up, and with each one, a chill crept further into her bones. When she finally saw him again, it was in the hallway. Mr. Carmichael leaned against the wall, arms crossed, an unsettling smile on his face. "I heard you've been talking to lawyers," he said casually, as if they were chatting about the weather. "You really think you can win against me?" Tasha's mouth went dry. She said nothing, clutching the folder against her chest like armor. "Be careful," he added, his smile never fading. "This building has a way of chewing people up who don't follow the rules." The days that followed became a blur of fear and frustration. Strange things began happening in the building. Her water would turn ice cold mid-shower. The hallway lights outside her door flickered out completely, only hers. Packages started disappearing from her doorstep, and once, someone left a dead plant outside her door with a note that said, "You can't fight what owns you." Tasha tried reporting it to the police, but they dismissed it as civil issues. The landlord had plausible deniability. It all looked coincidental on paper, but she knew better. Lisa continued filing paperwork, confident the case would stand. "He's violating tenant rights," she reassured her. "Once this goes before a judge, the truth will come out." But Mr. Carmichael wasn't waiting for that. A week before the court date, Tasha received an eviction notice. It claimed she had failed to comply with lease terms, citing false infractions, unauthorized furniture, unsanitary conditions, disturbances. Lies, all of them. The paper trembled in her hands as she read it. She had 14 days to leave. She stormed into his office that afternoon, something she'd never done before. His assistant looked startled as Tasha stood there, shaking with fury. "Mr. Carmichael is busy," the assistant said flatly. "I'll wait," Tasha said. She waited nearly an hour before he finally appeared. He didn't even look surprised to see her. "Tasha," he said coolly, "you really shouldn't have gone to lawyers. This could have been simple." "Simple?" she snapped. "You're evicting me for nothing." He leaned closer, voice calm but venomous. "You think the system cares about you? You're one tenant in a city of millions. You can scream all you want, but when that gavel falls, I'll still own this building. And you'll be gone." Her blood ran cold. The following week felt like a countdown to disaster. Each day, she felt the weight of the fight pressing down harder. The whispers in the hallway, the cold stares from neighbors who suddenly avoided her eyes. It was as if she had become a ghost before even leaving. Lisa tried to keep herself strong. "He's bluffing," she said during their final meeting before court. "This is harassment. I've seen landlords like him crumble when the evidence comes out. You just have to hold your ground." But something about the way Mr. Carmichael carried himself, that unwavering confidence, made Tasha uneasy. He wasn't bluffing. He was planning something. The night before the hearing, she found an envelope slid under her door. Inside was a single photograph, taken from behind, walking home late at night. Written across the bottom in sharp black ink, "You don't belong here." Tasha froze, heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Someone had been watching her. Not just Mr. Carmichael, someone he sent. She called Lisa immediately. "This is intimidation," Lisa said firmly. "Keep the photo. Bring it to court. It'll prove what he's been doing." But deep down, Tasha wasn't sure proof would be enough. The court date arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Rain pelted the windows of the courthouse as Tasha stood outside, clutching her folder like a lifeline. She felt small beneath the looming stone building, dwarfed by the weight of what she was about to face. Inside, Mr. Carmichael waited. He was dressed sharply, his expression calm and composed, flanked by his lawyer, a man who looked like he'd been doing this for decades. They greeted the judge with practiced smiles. Tasha felt like she was stepping into a trap. Lisa presented their case with clarity, detailing the unlawful rent increases, the harassment, the false accusations. She handed over photos, letters, timestamps, every scrap of evidence they'd gathered. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. Then it was Mr. Carmichael's turn. His lawyer rose smoothly, voice calm but commanding. He painted a different picture. A problem tenant, who refused maintenance visits, who damaged property, who spread false accusations to avoid paying fair rent. Each lie was delivered with precision. They even produced fabricated photos, messy rooms, cracked walls, piles of trash, none of which were hers. Lisa objected furiously, but the damage was done. The judge looked uncertain now, glancing between the two sides. And then came the final blow, a witness. A neighbor, someone Tasha had greeted countless times in the hallway, stood and claimed she had seen strange activity coming from Tasha's apartment. She described loud arguments and property damage. But all eyes. Tasha's stomach dropped. She couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in. The judge called for a recess. Outside, Tasha leaned against the cold wall, trembling. Lisa's voice was calm but strained. "They're trying to discredit you," she said. "Don't lose your composure. We'll refute it." But deep inside, Tasha knew something was slipping away. When the hearing resumed, it was brief. The judge announced that the case required further review, but in the meantime, the eviction would stand. Tasha felt the floor fall from beneath her. She had lost, not completely, but enough to destroy her life. Mr. Carmichael's faint smile across the room told her everything. He had won. As she walked out of the courthouse, rain pouring down, she felt hollow. Lisa tried to reassure her, promising to appeal, to fight again. But the fight had already taken everything. Her home. Her security. Her sense of safety. By the time she returned to her building, the locks had already been changed. Her belongings were sealed inside. A single paper taped to the door read, "Vacant, property reclaimed." She stood there, soaked, staring at the word vacant as if it were her own name. That night, she slept in her car. The city's glow through the fogged windshield blurred her tears into streaks of light. She had done everything right, followed the law, sought help, told the truth, and yet somehow, the system had crushed her anyway. The next morning, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A new "for rent" sign on her old door, advertising the same apartment she'd been evicted from. The price? Nearly double what she'd been paying. It had never been about violations or rules. It was greed. Pure, calculated greed. And as she sat there in silence, something inside her shifted. The fear turned to anger. The kind of anger that doesn't fade. The kind that seeks justice, no matter the cost. Tasha wasn't done yet. She would make sure the world knew who Mr. Carmichael really was. And when she did, he would regret ever underestimating her. The days after the court hearing moved in a haze of disbelief. Tasha drifted between anger and exhaustion, unable to process how easily her world had been stripped from her. She had fought for what was right, and still, she had been crushed beneath paperwork, lies, and polished smiles. But beneath the numbness, something colder began to form, resolve. She refused to vanish quietly. Tasha spent the next week collecting everything she could. Every message, every photo, every document that proved Mr. Carmichael's deceit. She visited other tenants, people who whispered about being overcharged or ignored when their apartments flooded. At first, they were hesitant, afraid of losing their homes, of being targeted the way she had. But one by one, they began to talk. Some slipped her old receipts showing rent increases that weren't authorized by the lease. Others showed notices written in the same intimidating tone she had received. By the time she was done, her small folder had become a thick binder, the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Lisa was stunned when she saw it. "Tasha," she said quietly, flipping through the pages, "this isn't just about you anymore. He's been doing this to half the tenants in that building." Tasha nodded. "Then it's time everyone sees it." The plan wasn't just to appeal, it was to expose. Lisa reached out to a local reporter she trusted, someone who had covered housing disputes before. Within days, Tasha found herself sitting under the harsh lights of a camera, her voice steady but raw as she recounted everything. The harassment, the eviction, the lies. She handed over the documents, the photos, the proof that Mr. Carmichael had built his empire on intimidation and greed. The story aired 2 nights later. It wasn't sensationalized, it didn't need to be. The truth was damning enough. The headline was simple: Landlord accused of illegal rent increases and tenant harassment. But what caught everyone's attention was the image of Mr. Carmichael's building, the same polished, modern complex that hid so much rot beneath its surface. And for the first time, people started asking questions. By morning, The fallout had begun. Other tenants stepped forward publicly, some with documents, others with stories that mirrored Tasha's. The local tenant rights group picked it up. Social media exploded with outrage. Within 48 hours, a city inspector was seen walking through the property, clipboard in hand, speaking to residents, taking notes, snapping photos. And then, finally, a message came through Lisa's phone from the court clerk's office. The appeal hearing has been granted. Tasha's chest tightened. It was happening. The second court hearing felt different from the first. The energy in the room was heavier, charged with something that felt like justice waiting to break through. Mr. Carmichael walked in wearing the same tailored suit, but this time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not confidence, but calculation. His lawyer whispered rapidly to him, their expressions tense. Across the aisle, Tasha sat straighter than she had in weeks, her binder of evidence on the table before her. Lisa, calm as ever, leaned close and said, "This time, we make them listen." When the judge entered, the tension snapped into silence. Lisa began with the new evidence, receipts, communications, statements from tenants, and the inspection report. She presented it methodically, layer by layer, like bricks building a wall too high to climb. The judge's expression hardened with each revelation. Then came the part no one expected, the recordings. One tenant, brave enough to help, had secretly recorded a conversation with Mr. Carmichael's property manager. On the audio, his voice was clear. "Carmichael says raise the rent. If they don't like it, we'll find someone who pays double. Make up the violations if you have to." The courtroom went still. The judge's gaze shifted sharply toward Mr. Carmichael. For the first time, the landlord's calm demeanor cracked. He leaned back, eyes darting toward his lawyer, his jaw tightening. Lisa continued, presenting each piece of evidence until there was no room left for excuses. When it was Mr. Carmichael's turn to speak, his words stumbled. He called it a misunderstanding, blamed a rogue employee, and tried to frame Tasha as a disgruntled tenant. But the tone had changed. No one was buying it anymore. Then the judge spoke. "Mr. Carmichael," he said slowly, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "it appears this case extends far beyond a simple tenant dispute. This court finds sufficient grounds to refer these matters for further legal investigation, including fraud and harassment." The silence that followed was electric. Mr. Carmichael's lawyer muttered something under his breath, but the damage was irreversible. Reporters who had come to cover the hearing scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Cameras flashed outside the doors. For the first time, Tasha saw something in Mr. Carmichael's face that she had never seen before: fear. The story spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within a day, local news stations were replaying the courtroom footage. The audio recording became headline material. Former tenants came forward from other properties owned by Mr. Carmichael, each with eerily similar experiences. It wasn't long before the city announced an official investigation. Inspectors flooded his buildings, uncovering years of violations, falsified records, and unsafe living conditions. The facade of control he had built was crumbling brick by brick. And through it all, Tasha remained quiet. She didn't need to gloat or shout. Her silence said everything. But there was one more confrontation waiting, one final moment that would seal his downfall. A week later, Tasha returned to her old building. This time, she wasn't there as a tenant but as a witness for the ongoing investigation. The once pristine lobby now looked abandoned, plants dying, the air heavy with neglect. The same "for rent" sign still hung crooked on the front window. She was walking out after giving her statement when she saw him. Mr. Carmichael stood near the doorway, phone pressed to his ear, his expression pale and drawn. His suit, once immaculate, was wrinkled. He looked up and froze when he saw her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. There was no anger left in Tasha's face, only something deeper, quiet, steady vindication. He lowered the phone, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Around them, the sound of cameras clicked. Reporters had gathered outside, waiting for his exit. One of them shouted his name, and the flashbulbs erupted. Mr. Carmichael tried to shield his face, but it was too late. That photo, the once proud landlord caught mid-glare, Tasha, standing calmly behind him, became the defining image of the story. It ran on every major news outlet the next morning with the headline, "Landlord who evicted tenant faces fraud investigation." The same building that had been his empire was now the backdrop of his humiliation. In the weeks that followed, the dominoes continued to fall. Mr. Carmichael was charged with multiple violations, including falsifying rent documents and unlawful evictions. His company's assets were frozen pending investigation. Tenants across his properties organized, supported by housing rights groups that cited Tasha's case as the turning point. For years, he had used intimidation as his weapon. Now, his own arrogance had exposed him. And as for Tasha, she wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become a symbol. When the final report aired, showing the full story of her eviction, the courtroom confrontation, and the legal aftermath, the closing line struck deep. She tried to sue her landlord, and nearly lost everything. But in the end, she took down an empire. The video went viral within days. Tasha watched it quietly from her new apartment, a small, sunlit space overlooking a quiet street. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. The air smelled of freedom. She had gone through hell, but she had come out with something no eviction notice could take away, her dignity. And as she watched the screen fade to black, a single thought crossed her mind. Maybe sometimes, losing everything is the only way to see who you really are. The dust never settled quietly. Justice has a sound, not a bang, not a roar, but a slow, grinding echo that reverberates through lives long after the headlines fade. 4 weeks following the hearing, Tasha's story rippled across the city like a storm rolling over rooftops. Reporters called it the fall of a landlord king. Activists called it a victory for tenants' rights. But for Tasha, it was something much simpler, a reckoning. The man who had once held her life in his hands was now the one being investigated, interrogated, and stripped of everything he'd built through intimidation. It was poetic in a way that only reality could deliver, messy, imperfect, but undeniably fair. Mr. Carmichael's empire had been built on fear. He had hidden behind polished smiles and perfect paperwork, counting on people's silence to protect him. But silence, once broken, spreads faster than control. Within months, multiple lawsuits emerged. Former tenants filed claims, backed by evidence. Tasha's courage had inspired them to gather. Each case was a new nail in the coffin of his reputation. The City Housing Board eventually launched a full audit of every property it owned. Inspectors uncovered hundreds of code violations, faulty wiring, black mold, and falsified safety certificates. It was a domino collapse. The once proud model landlord found himself in headlines again, this time for criminal negligence and fraud. Tasha watched it all unfold from afar. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just watched. The same man who had smiled at her as he handed her an eviction notice was now being escorted from his office by officials, reporters swarming around him like vultures circling something long dead. Justice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's quiet and methodical. And this was one of those times. The media eventually lost interest. The story that had once burned bright became another segment in a long list of exposés. But for the tenants still living in those buildings, it changed everything. New management took over, the rent stabilized, maintenance requests were finally answered, and people started to breathe again. The fear that had once crept through the hallways was gone. Tasha became a name they spoke with quiet gratitude, the one who stood up when no one else did. Her new apartment wasn't luxurious, but it felt alive. The walls were plain white, and the furniture mismatched, but it carried the weight of her resilience. Every morning, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, warming her skin. The old binder, the same one that had once held her evidence, now sat on her bookshelf like a relic from another life. She had started writing too. Not about the pain, but about the system, about how ordinary people could fight back against those who weaponized power and paperwork. Her articles found their way into local blogs, tenant forums, and eventually, national outlets. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was amplifying the voices of those who still lived in silence. Her story became a case study, used in workshops, tenant advocacy panels, even college lectures. People dissected the details, the psychology, the imbalance of power. But what none of them could capture was the feeling of that night she stood outside her old apartment, rain running down her face, realizing everything she'd worked for had been stolen. That moment was what forged her resolve. She had lost everything, and gained something no one could take. Meanwhile, Mr. Carmichael's downfall continued to spiral. The financial strain of multiple lawsuits and mounting fines gutted his company. Properties were seized, sold off, or abandoned. His once coveted reputation as a community visionary became a warning label in the real estate world. Investors cut ties. Business partners distanced themselves. His name, once whispered with respect, became synonymous with greed and corruption. He tried, briefly, to rebuild. There were rumors he'd moved states, rebranding under a new business name. But the internet never forgets. Each attempt was met with articles, posts, and videos linking him to the scandal. No amount of new paint could cover the cracks anymore. For the first time, he knew what it felt like to lose control. And Tasha? She had already moved on. Months passed before she ever returned to her old neighborhood. Not because she missed it, but because she wanted closure. The building stood quiet now under new management, its facade repainted, the cracks sealed. Children played in the courtyard again, laughter echoing where tension once lived. She stood across the street for a long time, hands tucked into her coat pockets, the cold wind brushing her hair. It felt strange, like visiting a grave, the ghost of her old life standing just beyond those windows. But she wasn't haunted anymore. She took a deep breath, turned, and walked away. Her story could have ended there, with quiet peace and a lesson learned. But life has a way of turning survivors into catalysts. 6 months later, she received an invitation to speak at a housing conference. It was a modest event, filled with community organizers, attorneys, and residents fighting similar battles. She hesitated at first. The thought of reliving everything made her chest tighten. But then she remembered the faces of the tenants who had stepped forward because she did. She accepted. When she stepped onto that stage, the lights felt less like interrogation lamps and more like sunrise. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone who had navigated the labyrinth and lived to map it out. She talked about fear, how it's used to silence. About paperwork, how it's weaponized to confuse. And about resilience, how it begins with one act of defiance. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence in the room was heavy, full, reverent. When she stepped down, a woman approached her, older, trembling slightly, and whispered, "Because of you, I'm fighting my landlord too." That moment hit harder than any courtroom victory ever could. Tasha's life didn't turn perfect after that. Bills still came. Work was still tiring. The world didn't magically fix itself. But something in her had changed forever. A quiet power that came from surviving the impossible and refusing to break. Every time she passed a "for rent" sign now, she saw more than numbers and walls. She saw stories, people trying to build safety out of fragile spaces. And she never forgot the night she lost hers. Sometimes she would walk past the courthouse where everything had unraveled and smile faintly. It no longer represented failure or fear. It represented truth, the kind that takes time, pain, and persistence to uncover. Years later, when someone interviewed her for a podcast about housing reform, they asked if she regretted any of it: the lawsuit, the eviction, the sleepless nights. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Regret? The system had tried to erase her, but in doing so, it had made her unforgettable. The interviewer described her afterward as calm but unbreakable. The phrase stuck. People started referring to her that way online, sharing clips of her speech, tagging her story with quotes like, "She lost everything, but found her voice." Her story became more than a case. It became a movement. Meanwhile, Mr. Carmichael's world grew smaller. He avoided cameras now, dodged reporters, and moved often. The arrogance that had once defined him had evaporated, leaving behind only a shadow of the man who thought himself untouchable. The final time Tasha saw his name was in a small news article buried deep online. A notice about his company declaring bankruptcy. No photo. No follow-up. Just an ending sentence that read, "Former property owner cites financial mismanagement and legal difficulties." She read it once, closed the tab, and never looked again. There was no satisfaction in his ruin, only peace in knowing that the truth had finally leveled the scales. One evening, years later, Tasha stood on the balcony of her new apartment, watching the sunset wash the city in gold. The air smelled of rain, the same way it had that night she first stood outside her old building, broken and defeated. But now, the rain wasn't a symbol of loss. It was cleansing. She leaned on the railing, eyes closed, letting the cool wind brush her face. In the distance, a siren wailed, cars honked, life continued, messy, imperfect, real. She smiled to herself. Her story had begun with a broken system, a cruel landlord, and a fight she was never supposed to win. It ended with something far greater, not revenge, not victory, but transformation. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about rebuilding what was taken, stronger than before. As the last light of day faded, Tasha whispered a silent promise to herself, to keep fighting, to keep writing, to keep reminding the world that power doesn't belong to those who take, but to those who endure. And though her name might one day fade from the news, her impact wouldn't. Because somewhere out there, another tenant would find courage in her story. Another person would stand their ground. Another landlord would think twice. And that, more than any verdict, any article, any viral video, was the real victory. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it echoes, quietly, through the lives of those who refuse to be silenced. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.